My name's Alice Tipping. I lead IISD's trade policy work, and I'd like, before we start, to acknowledge the support of the Swedish International Development Agency, who support our work on fisheries subsidies, including, of course, this webinar. So we're at, I think it's fair to say, an interesting place in the WTO fisheries subsidies negotiations here in the middle of July 2025. In the years since the first part of the agreement was concluded, since 2022, members have several times come very close to concluding the additional provisions that they promised to add to the agreement at that point. Now, in the middle of 2025, it seems as if we're moving from one phase of the negotiations into another, as yet unclear. And we thought at this moment of transition, it would be a good moment, a good opportunity to take stock of what members have on the table, what your governments have negotiated so far. And we thought we would do that by looking back at the last negotiating text that was circulated by the chair of the negotiations back in December 2024. So to do this, I'm going to invite my colleague Tristan Erschlinger, who's a senior policy advisor and focuses on fisheries subsidies. I'm going to ask him to walk you through the text. Now, don't worry, both the recording of his presentation and his slides will be made available after the webinar, so you don't need to worry about taking down every detail. You can focus perhaps on absorbing the overall picture. It is a complicated text. It is quite dense, which means Tristan has quite a lot to get through in his presentation. We will have just his presentation. We're not going to seek to add in additional content. What he gives you, I think, will be enough to absorb. But maybe to make the best use of the time we have for discussion after his presentation, I'd encourage you to put any questions that you have in the Q&A box, and you can see that at the bottom of your screen, Q&A with the little question mark. And I'd encourage you to put your questions in that box as he talks, as questions come to you, which means that I will keep an eye on that box and I will pick questions up. I'll group them if I can, so that we make best use of the time that we have for questions and answers after the presentation. Now, while his presentation is recorded, per our usual practice, the open discussion following the presentation will not be recorded. So you can feel free to ask questions without fear that they will end up on the internet. So with that very brief introduction, I won't take any more time. I'll give you the floor next, Tristan, to walk us through the latest text that we have. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Alice, and hi everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you for this webinar. So yes, I hope you'll find it useful. As Alice mentioned, the idea is really to help everybody to examine the latest draft text and also to provide somewhat of an assessment of where we are at the end of the presentation, in particular from a sustainable development angle. So as a quick introduction, I wanted to start by saying a few words on why concluding these further rules on fisheries subsidies is so important, and then we'll move directly to the text itself. So an important way to start here is to remind ourselves of what the existing agreement on fisheries subsidies covers. And here, in essence, what we can say is that the agreement prohibits fisheries subsidies in the most alarming situations where concerns about the sustainability impacts of subsidies are the clearest. So when it's clear that some actors engage in IUU fishing activities, when we know that fish stocks are overfished and there are no measures to rebuild them, and when fishing takes place in the unregulated high seas. So these rules are key, but it's also clear that subsidies can have harmful impacts in many other situations. This can be the case when there is IUU fishing or when stocks are overfished, but there's no capacity to trigger the agreement's rules with IUU fishing determinations or stock assessments. But also subsidies can be very harmful when there's no IUU fishing or no stock is overfished yet, but subsidies still lead to excessive fishing levels because they encourage the creation of too much fishing capacity, or simply because they incentivize existing fleets to fish too much. And this can go on for a while before a stock is actually considered to be overfished. So we really see that the problem starts earlier than the situations covered in the 2022 agreement. So this is why further rules are really essential to better address the underlying role of subsidies as a driver of overcapacity and overfishing, and at the end of the day to protect the marine environment, but also people's livelihoods. So that's the crucial sustainable development outcome that all of you, all WTO members, are trying to achieve. But let's now turn to the rules and look at them together so that we can see better where we are in terms of the latest suggested disciplines. And here to kick off, maybe just a few preliminary points. First, to emphasize that IISD has published a written analysis of the draft text for these additional provisions. So you have the link here, and we'll distribute the slides. Second, both this analysis and my presentation today are based on the latest version of the draft text, so the one from November last year, and you have the document's symbol here, that's the 285 text. Two caveats as well, to highlight that this presentation will reflect our understanding of the text, but other readings may be possible. And also to flag that, of course, nothing is agreed yet. So what we are talking about is a draft text. And finally, a general point of framing already on substance to highlight that the suggested additional provisions should be read and interpreted in the context of the existing framework set by the 2022 Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies. So the horizontal provisions of this agreement will equally apply to the additional provisions under the Fish 2 text. And so they include provisions on scope, on definitions, particular provisions for LDCs, technical assistance and capacity building, notification and transparency, institutional arrangements, dispute settlement, as well as the final provisions that are found in the agreement. Okay, so let's now turn to the rules. And here we'll start by looking at what is really the central rule in that text. This main rule reflects a so-called hybrid approach on which members gradually converged between 2019 and 2024. And so why is it hybrid? Because it combines a general subsidy prohibition with an exemption based on fisheries management and special and differential treatment exemptions. Negotiations were actually already focusing on a similar approach in 2022 ahead of MC12 in Geneva. But not all the parameters of that rule could be agreed at the time. And so when negotiations resumed in 2023, members went back to the drawing board and gradually converged again around this type of approach. But importantly, several important changes were made to the suggested rules, in particular to try to accommodate some members' concerns that the rules needed to be stronger for big players. So the first element of the rule has been quite stable for a while. It's a general prohibition of subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, which specifies that such subsidies include a list of specific subsidy types because they are typically considered as the most likely to incentivize overcapacity and overfishing. The list includes, for example, subsidies related to the acquisition or modernization of vessels, the purchase of engines, machinery, and equipment, or those to cover the cost of fuel and other variable inputs. And there are also other types of subsidies that are listed. So the list here on the slide is not exhaustive. The only relatively recent change is that just before MC13, so last year, subsidies for subsistence purpose during the seasonal closure of fisheries were explicitly excluded from the list. And importantly, the list is not an exhaustive one. So other types of subsidies may also be prohibited under that rule. This general prohibition is then accompanied by an exemption or a qualifier related to fisheries management. And what this exemption says is that subsidies are not prohibited if measures are implemented to maintain the relevant fish stocks at a biologically sustainable level. To benefit from that exemption, the subsidizing member would have to make a demonstration in its subsidy notification and possibly also through further exchange with other members at the committee level. And the text also specifies that these notifications must include a number of elements, and that includes information on fisheries management measures, on the status of fish stocks, on catch data, as well as information on fleet capacity. So that's for the part that is common to all members who will have to apply this exemption. But very importantly, not all the requirements that must be met to benefit from this exemption are exactly the same for all members. And that's a key difference actually with the text that was considered ahead of and at MC12. And this is meant to respond to a call by many members to have stricter disciplines for members with larger scale or more heavily subsidized fishing sectors. So following this approach, members are essentially divided into two tiers with stricter requirements applied to members in the first tier. So that first tier includes all developed members and then developing members that fish in very distant waters, those that are in the world's top 10 subsidizers, and also those that have made a commitment not to use special and differential treatment provisions. And so for these members in tier 1, the demonstration of management measures must be more detailed and extensive than for others. So here the text specifies that their demonstration would need to include an explanation of how those measures ensure or can reasonably be expected to ensure that stocks are maintained at a sustainable level. And so the objective here is to ensure that only good or at least credible management measures will allow the use of this exemption. And then still for members in tier 1, the demonstration must be made within 6 months when a new subsidy is introduced, so quite quickly. Then for all the other developing country members that are not completely exempted from the main prohibition, they would fall in the second tier. And so for these members, the demonstration of sustainable management measures can be less detailed, so without the specific explanation that we just mentioned. And it can also be made in their regular subsidy notifications, which are due every 2 years. So they have more time to do it. And finally, there's a third element to this main rule, which you see here in the smaller gray box at the top. And what this provision does is that it introduces an obligation for members to provide timely and comprehensive written answers when other members ask for clarification on the information that they have provided. So the objective here is to ensure that meaningful exchanges can take place between members at the committee level. And this is quite important to allow for robust scrutiny of the subsidies and of the demonstrations that are made by members under this management exemption. So that's really the main prohibition and its management-related exemption, which is accessible to all members. Now, as you probably know, the text also includes special and differential treatment provisions in Article B, and these consist of a series of exemptions from the main prohibition for developing country members or specific groups of developing country members. So first, the text includes 2 complete permanent exemptions from the main prohibition for particular groups of developing countries. So an exemption for least developed country members who would continue to benefit from this exemption for a number of years once they graduate out of the LDC category, and the duration of this period is still undetermined in the text. And then another exemption for developing members that are small fishing nations. which in concrete terms here means any developing member that accounts for less than 0.8% of global catch. And if one of these members would then move above the 0.8% threshold for 3 consecutive years, it would then be expected to comply with the more general rule and flexibility is applicable to other developing country members. So to summarize, in short, here, these two groups of members, for them, the main prohibition simply does not apply. Then Article B3 establishes a transitional exemption for developing country members' subsidies. And the important part here is that it really applies to subsidies to all fishing in the EEZ or under RFMOs, including large-scale fishing. And that's the most important part because we'll see that there is a particular exemption, a specific exemption for small-scale fishing. And a key point here is that it is not decided yet. There is no suggested duration for this transitional exemption. So it's still an X in the text. And finally, as I just mentioned, the text also includes a permanent exemption for small-scale and artisanal fishing. And it specifies that the exemption covers activities that are primarily low-income, resource-poor, or livelihood in nature. But there is no geographical limit anymore for the activities that are covered under this flexibility in this version of the text, which, as you probably know, has been the subject of a lot of debate. Here, the fishing activities covered by the exemption would be operationally defined by the subsidizing member, according to the text. And members using that flexibility would also have an obligation to notify their national definition of this category of fishing, as well as the subsidies that are provided under this provision. An important point here is that this exemption also includes a footnote which includes two important elements. First, it specifies that the flexibility should not apply to fishing activities that are industrial. And this is meant to be a safeguard to provide certainty that industrial activities do not end up benefiting from this carve-out. And this language has evolved in the two last iterations of the text in an attempt to respond to the concerns of several developing members who were concerned that the previous versions of that language were too constraining. So the previous wording that was used was first significantly commercial and then industrialized. And so that's an attempt to take those concerns into account. Second, the footnote also includes a list of illustrative characteristics that members may take into account when considering what is small-scale and artisanal. And it's important to note that several members have flagged that they are still not comfortable with this footnote or even with the wording of the exemption itself. Some members because they find it too permissive, others because they find it too constraining. So it seems that in any case, this is an area where further discussion will be needed. Then on top of these exemptions, there's a last provision in Article B that's very important, and it's Article B5. It's reflected here in the gray box on that slide, and it encourages subsidizing developing country members to make a voluntary commitment not to use SDT provisions. Why was it included? Because some of the world's largest fishing nations and subsidizers are developing members. So this provision could allow for the rules to cover all major subsidizers if these members choose to make such a voluntary commitment, at least under the current wording of the text. Now, some members have also indicated that they are not comfortable with the current shape of that provision or the current wording of that provision. So it looks like further work may be needed here as well. So overall, it seems that there's still quite a high degree of convergence on the overall structure of the SDT provisions and the various components that they should include. But it also appears that more discussion will be needed to have a version with which all members are comfortable. Now, on top of the main prohibition, the text also includes rules that apply specifically to subsidies targeted at distant water fishing. And here there are essentially two rules. The first rule requires members to refrain to the greatest extent possible from providing subsidies that are targeted at fishing and fishing-related activities beyond their waters. The exact language that's used is subsidies that are contingent upon or tied to these distant water fishing activities. And in concrete terms, this means subsidies that are specifically designed for distant water fishing, which in practice provide the bulk of their benefits to distant water fishing. And looking at this first obligation, of course, we see that it's softer than a prohibition, but it is also important to note that it is unconditional, and it does apply in all circumstances, which is a key difference from the previous version of the text. Then the second rule, which is found in Article A2B, then provides that these subsidies are actually prohibited unless sustainability-related criteria are fulfilled. And these criteria are very similar to those that would need to be met to benefit from the sustainability-based exemption for the main prohibition. So they require a quick and detailed demonstration that measures are implemented to maintain relevant fish stocks at a sustainable level, including notified information on subsidy amount, fleet capacity, and catch data. So there's a conditional prohibition similar to the main prohibition, which prohibits subsidies targeted at distant water fishing unless credible management measures are in place. And then, even when such management measures are present, there is an unconditional restraint obligation, which says that members must always do everything they can not to provide those subsidies. And finally, there's also a dedicated monitoring process to scrutinize these subsidies targeted at distant water fishing, as well as the application of the rule. So the idea is that particular attention would go into monitoring those subsidies, and this should include, among other things, the impact of these programs on small island developing states and LDC members. Now, on top of these two substantive obligations, the text also includes a few transparency obligations, which come in addition to the more general transparency obligations in the 2022 agreement. So here, members would need to notify the committee each year of two different things. First, the vessels and operators for which there is information that reasonably indicates the use of forced labor. And second, a list of fisheries access agreements or arrangements to which there are parties, including the title and the parties to that particular agreement or arrangement. The first of those two elements is highlighted in yellow in the draft text, and that's to indicate that particular members have very divergent views on this particular provision. Then, in addition, the text provides that members would need to notify information that would allow for determination of their annual aggregate level of fisheries subsidies. And so the text has some details about how and when this should be done. But maybe just a last note here to say that this is now a somewhat slimmed down version of the transparency provisions that have been considered since MC12. And that's because consensus looked difficult to achieve on a number of points that were included in the previous versions of the text. So some of these elements were removed. There was a conditional obligation to notify the full text of access agreements. There was a notification obligation about non-specific fuel subsidies. And there was also an explicit condition to have notified subsidies in order to access some of the exemptions. And so these elements don't appear in the latest version of the text because it looked difficult to reach consensus of those in those particular elements. Okay, so now we reach what are really the last key elements of the draft text. And there are essentially three of them. The first one is Article D1, and it's a key part of the balance in the draft text. The reason for that is that at MC13, important concerns were raised by a regional group of members about the overall ambition in the text. And so after very intensive work, the compromise that was found was to include a strong review clause for these additional provisions. So that's what we have in Article D1. It's essentially a dedicated process for reviewing the operation of the additional disciplines within 5 years of entry into force. The provision is quite detailed, and it specifies that the review would need to consider a whole range of factors, including the economic benefits that small island developing states and least developed country members are able to derive from sustainable fishing. The review would identify if changes are needed to make the rules more effective, and if subsidy levels have increased, it's specified that such changes may include quantitative limits or reductions, so the committee may recommend such changes unless members determine that other changes are more appropriate. We can note here that the language was actually even stronger in the text from MC13 because it introduced an actual obligation to recommend quantitative limits and reductions if subsidies went up, but it was adjusted to accommodate some sensitivities about the strength of the review clause. And so a final element here is that the outcome of this review would be considered by the next WTO Ministerial Conference, so really at the highest level in the organization. Then there is also a second important provision in Article D, which you see here in orange, because that's actually an obligation on members. And it's a general obligation on members anytime they grant a subsidy to consider its consequence on overcapacity and overfishing. So obviously, in legal terms, it's clearly not as strong as a prohibition, but it's still an obligation and an important reminder of the basic objective of these additional provisions. And finally, the draft text provides that these additional provisions and the 2022 agreement together constitute a complete agreement. So that's important because at MC12, WTO members committed to achieve a comprehensive agreement on fisheries subsidies. So here, the draft text clarifies that if the additional disciplines are concluded, members will have delivered on this mandate, and as a result, the termination clause in Article 12 of the 2022 agreement would be deactivated. Good. So that's it for the review of the text. But to conclude the presentation, and as you, WTO members, consider the next steps in these negotiations and how they could be brought to successful conclusion, a crucial question is to assess where we are from a sustainable development perspective. So with this in mind, here are a few considerations that we thought would be useful to keep in mind. First, an important reminder that concluding these additional rules is actually crucial from a sustainable development perspective. And that's because the rules, these rules, the additional rules, are broader than those agreed in 2022, and they also have the potential for broader impact. The 2022 agreement is essential, but it only targets specific situations. And so the proposed additional rules go further because they really aim to prevent subsidies from contributing to overfishing in the first place. Second, another key point is that the draft reflects members' attempt to find compromises and to strike balances at many levels between current fishing nations and those that have plans to grow their fleets in the future, between members with good fisheries management and those that still need to build their systems, between small-scale fishing and large-scale fishing, and also between the short-term needs of fishing communities and the longer-term imperative to move towards more sustainable fishing. So it's really a complex balancing act. And of course, the logical consequence of this is that the text is not anybody's ideal set of rules, and it's not perfect either from a sustainability perspective. So a first example of this is the management-related exemption in the main rule. Various members have argued that this exemption should be as strict as possible, and they called for the text to provide explicitly that only management measures with proven effectiveness could allow subsidies to continue. That would indeed have been stronger from a strict sustainability perspective, but it was met with strong resistance from other members who argued that the effectiveness of fisheries management is difficult to prove, even when fisheries management systems are well developed. And on special and differential treatment, we saw somewhat similar dynamics. Some members called for targeted flexibilities and argued that wider flexibilities risked to undermine the sustainability objective of the rules. But in response, many developing countries said that subsidies were their only tool to support the immediate needs of small-scale fishers and to grow their own fleets, and that fisheries management was both difficult and expensive to put in place. So the point here is that it's not perfect from a strict sustainability perspective. It could have been more ambitious. It's not perfect for anybody. But after years of very hard negotiating work, many positions have been voiced, many options have been tried, and this text simply reflects the set of disciplines on which members have managed to find the highest level of convergence. So now the key question becomes, okay, that's where members have found the most convergence. But is a set of rules like this or something close to this, is it actually worth having, right? Is it enough? And here, from IISD's perspective, it's pretty clear that the text does represent a lot of value in terms of, in sustainable development terms. First, because the text clearly prohibits the most risky types of subsidies when no credible management measures are in place. As we've seen, the effectiveness of these measures is not explicitly required, but the text also makes it clear that only credible management measures can justify the continuation of risky subsidies. So it could have been stronger, but it's clearly not empty either. Second, regarding special and differential treatment, one of the exemptions is actually quite wide, but it's also only temporary. And that's the transition period for developing members' subsidies in the EEZ and under RFMOs. So if you look at the numbers, it shows that the other exemptions, those that are permanent, are actually much smaller in scale. So they exclude less fishing and less subsidies from the application of the main rule. So here again, the rules could have been more ambitious from a strict sustainability perspective, but they are far from being empty. Very importantly, these disciplines would subject fisheries subsidies to scrutiny that simply doesn't exist today. And this would place the issue explicitly on the ongoing international agenda in a WTO committee. And that is scrutiny, but that's also agenda setting. So this would really make fisheries subsidies and their sustainability an important international policy issue, which today is clearly not the case. And then this would also contribute to a more normative change because this would essentially change the public's expectation of policymakers. And here, I mean, really everybody's expectation. So in general, fisheries subsidies would be expected to align with sustainability objectives. And so that would be the new norm that would shape policymakers' thinking and behavior as they design and implement subsidy policies and measures. Finally, just a last point here to say that from a more systemic perspective and in the context of the current debate on WTO reform, these rules, we believe, also would be a useful demonstration that WTO rulemaking can evolve and that WTO rules can be really tailored to a particular issue by taking into account the particularities and the realities of that issue. And that's something we see very clearly in the SDT provisions and how they are structured, but also in the substantive disciplines, for example, with this tier system. So for all these reasons, our conclusion at IISD is that without being perfect, the suggested rules are the result of years of painstaking work to find compromises between initially very divergent positions, and that in terms of substance, they do represent a lot of value. So yeah, we think that engaging to find a landing zone and to secure this value as soon as possible would be a wise approach. Of course, this will require some real drive. So I guess I'll simply conclude by encouraging all of you, all delegations, to contribute to generate that drive that could bring those negotiations to successful conclusion.